Cool. Okay. Thanks, Ozzy. Thanks, Rodent Society. Thanks, Virginia Tech. Thank you, Keith, Fabi, Anna. Shout out, you guys. A lot of love. Thank you. Appreciate it. Um, yeah, so I like to just start off with this photo of myself as a kid. It's the only photograph I have of myself, or that I carry of myself as a kid. And it's interesting to just look at it after, I guess, 7 years of making artwork or focusing on like a particular theme for a long time and just reflecting on like this is what I once was and innocent child unscarred um, from death and just the things that my work deals with. So I'll start. I'm gonna have to click it. Okay. So typically, I like to show this photograph first. It's the first photograph I made that actually felt like me and represented what I was doing at the time and what I was going through. A quiet riot. The image was made in 2016, shortly after my mother's death in April of that year. She died from an autoimmune disease disorder that made her body fight against itself. I was in college at Indiana University from 2014 to 2019 studying journalism, but quickly realized that I did not actually want to take images but create them. My mother's death was a catalyst for me, and this need to start expressing myself. It propelled me into realizing that I actually wanted to make art, and that's kind of what, since then, have put my life towards that. So I stopped studying journalism at Indiana and ended up getting a BFA. This image in particular was made back home in Miami, Florida. I was at the beach one night with my little sisters, which was often a venue for us when we were making photographs. I got under this plastic tarp and had Veronica snap photographs of me as I waded through the ocean water. This image gave birth to my thesis project titled Contact and put in motion for me the kind of art I wanted to make. So I began creating rituals with my family and started using them to re-examine the significance of death as part of life. Photographing the rituals re-invited death into our home and gave me time to live with it, as well as time to reclaim the experience. The more I became familiar with this presence, the more I began questioning myself. I found that the outcome was an exploration of grief and loss, getting intimate with death against the cultural context that often gets swept under the rug, even though it is one of life's few hard guarantees. I wanted to build a connection to death, hold space for it spiritually and ceremonially, instead of understanding it as a mistake, which I feel is often the way American society views death. I was excited to go through my mother's closet and her belongings, but was disappointed when my stepfather gave away a lot of her clothes already. All I found was a nightgown that was still wrapped up in a Macy's bag. I realized that she had probably never worn this dress, but purchased it. And so when I found it, the dress for me became a relic, and I started using it as a motif throughout the series, as well as a way to connect flesh and spirit. Here's the dress again. During this time, my family and I navigated into new transitioned roles and responsibilities. By creating healing spaces and ceremonies around these new responsibilities and roles, we began to confront the psychological and somatic shock that death delivers. As I said earlier, in Western American society, death is something that's become nearly invisible, something that's typically told to us or perhaps witnessed as a spectacle on TV. Contact builds an inner connection to death by working alongside it and questioning the lengths we go to sanitize it. A lot of these images were made at night. I for this project, I exclusively only photographed at night, and I really liked the idea of working in darkness and being consumed by the darkness and letting that kind of silence, like feeling that silence and feeling that presence of just nothing. And another thing that really made working at night special was the effect of using light. When you're working in photography and you're photographing at night, it takes a longer time for the image to register or burn onto the sensor of the film. So there was a deliberate stillness that you had to make when posing for images or when creating these images, because otherwise the image would be totally blurry. So stillness was a big thing, and the idea of adding light to darkness, like both metaphorically but also technically and conceptually, I thought really worked for me. And this isn't part of the series, but after the body of work, I made some images of my mother's tomb, and I always like to include these for context. And this was another interesting photograph that I made in 2019. It was kind of like a standalone image, but it was made near my mother's grave in the grass there. And I finally found somewhere to put it with this book coming out for me. But before that, it was kind of just this loose image that I've always been attached to. And it was interesting too working on this project because I felt like I also documented my sisters growing up during a certain, point in their life when their mother died and them being young teenagers. And so it marks kind of also like a coming of age story for them. So after contact in 2019, and after I had graduated from Indiana, I moved back to Miami, Florida, and I was working in corporate world, and I really hated it. And I decided to move to New Mexico in 2019. After that, um, up until that point, I had been focusing on a body of work called Contact, which we just went through briefly. Back then, I thought New Mexico would be a great place for me to continue this meditation on death, considering the natural elements of the desert, thinking about dryness and aridity as a place for life to also exist. But in the best possible ways, my direction unknowingly changed, and something else entirely gave way. I met Marcia when I was 23 years old, and we met at the El Dorado Library near Santa Fe. I was invited to attend a photo club meeting taking place at this library, and I happened to take a seat next to Marcia. She was 74 at the time. Everyone was probably 40 or even 50 years older than me at this club, but Marcia felt different. It felt like I was talking to someone my own age, and even looking at someone my own age with how she dressed. But what really intrigued me about Marcia was her voice. This slow, androgyny, earthy voice. That's what made me want to know more about her. And after talking for a couple of minutes, I knew immediately that I wanted to photograph her. A week went by before I invited her to my house, where we spoke for the first time about actually making a project together. I told Marcia that I wanted to photograph her mouth, which ended up being something that surprised us both. Marcia told me to call her phone and to let it ring to voicemail. What I heard was a quick, bright, and clear voice. In a way, it was a voice totally opposite to the one she has now. She told me that her voice prior to losing 3/4 of her tongue. She told me that that was her voice prior to losing 3/4 of her tongue, and prior to the 66 radiation treatments with chemotherapy. By interpreting these feelings in my own manner and trying to put myself in Marcia's shoes, we began to speak in vulnerable ways we hadn't before, which led us to question who we are to one another and who we are to ourselves, all while making photographs about it. What does a 13-hour surgery feel like? What is it like to have your voice replaced by one that isn't yours anymore? How does it feel to chew and eat? What do you do with your saliva when your tongue can't guide you to swallow? I dug a hole and Marcia jumped in. The day is bright and sunny, dirt and rocks against her skin. I asked her then to climb out of the hole, but what I really meant to ask was to see yourself alive. My work changed when my obsession changed, from my mother and death to life and what it meant to live. This led me to think of conflict and the significance conflict has in our lives, as well as what we do with conflict as people. I often think that without conflict, life ceases to continue. Things like change, illness, addiction, aging, blame, fear, emotional ambivalences, confusion, separations, and even strivings are the kinds of things I mean when I refer to conflict. What do we do when we are confronted with these challenges? How do we treat others in these moments? How do we treat ourselves in these moments? I'm interested in that mode of survival and using art as a way to beat something unbeatable or unchangeable. It was around this time too when COVID pandemic began and when my mentality started to change, that death to life mentality, and about the kind of work I thought I was going to be making. So I didn't know the kind of work that I'd be making at the time or what I wanted to be making, but I did know a few things. And I knew that I wanted a blank space to create images inside of, to literally build environments in and installations in. The first thing I tried with Marcia, Ozzy, and Alicia was making photographs in this racquetball court at night. But it wasn't long before the police came and we were told we could no longer use the public racquetball court as a studio. It was a silly thought, but something about the austere concrete walls and bareness of it all was where my mind was going. This spot would have been perfect had it been more accessible. The next venue after the racquetball court was a giant geodesic dome on this farm called Synergia Ranch. It was a cool experiment, but ultimately the space was also a bust and didn't end up working for me because of numerous reasons. But here are just some behind the scenes images for the memories. A lot of the images I felt like, even though an image cannot be successful, but the memories are always successful. And that's interesting. I really love that. And what really changed things was one day when Marcia showed me this mock-up she had built. She showed me, Ozzy, and Alicia actually when we were all hanging out at her house. It resembled the racquetball court perfectly. She looked at us then and suggested we build it outside on her property with a big smile on her face. Of course I was freaking out. I knew for sure then that Marcia was committed to all of this, maybe even more than I was. And it jolted me with such energy. It truly felt like anything was possible at the time. So every day for the next 9 months, I would work outside building this desert studio with Marcia, Aaron, Russell, Ozzy, Alicia, Keith, Sam, and Rodrigo. It's important to note that this was happening when the COVID pandemic was now in full swing. So there was a mandated quarantine, everything was closed, and stimulus checks were being sent to cover unemployment. In a way, these circumstances created an art residency for us all to do nothing but work on our art and ourselves. And I feel we really took advantage of that. So now I began making photographs in this structure, and with the new people entering my life, it became the environment for my most recent body of work, Trials. The feeling of the structure was that of a refuge. It was a shelter activated by the people and spirit. Yet at the same time, the structure can also feel like an arena where battles and strife rage. It's a space meant to absorb personal histories and energies every time it is used, and felt again the next time when entering. Collect narratives and decompartmentalize those narratives within imagery and within the space. Before I knew it, I found myself working with family again, a chosen kind of family, and a home space similar to that of my first body of work, Contact. Just as my mother's body became a battleground for survival, this outdoor space became a battleground for inner peace, foundation, and clarity. So this became the space for trials. This is the first image that I made in it. And something about this that was really interesting, as you can see, let me actually fast back forward to here. All the panels were blown off by the wind. So working with the elements of the natural elements of the desert was something that I really had to think about, and particularly the wind, because it is so strong over there that it will just parachute everything, and everything that you've worked on the next day will just be blown away. Since my workspace is outdoors year-round, nature isn't something you can go up against. I had to find ways to work alongside the desert and its elements. One way I began doing that was to only photograph in the morning. I learned that the wind was most calm in the early morning, to the point where you could hardly feel it. As the day goes on and afternoon comes in, the wind will be at its full strength. The morning light became my source of light, and I tried my best to make images within that first glow. I often would arrive to the space hours before the sun is supposed to rise and make sure I had everything ready. The splintering frames, peeling fabrics, and broken wood not only became a testament to New Mexico's harsh environment, but it also began to reference the wear and tear of the human body. The outcome of this body of work was a record of visual testimonies, with each image representing a standalone saga in that individual's life. We did this by translating our physical and mental conflicts into visual stories. The idea was to streamline all of our individual life stories into a record of growth and personal triumphs. If we can find that conflict, that friction or ambiguity, those life wounds, and freeze it into a photograph, I believe we can begin to mend ourselves. Photography is a visual language, which also makes it a language of metaphor and mystery, very similar to life. If you don't want to talk about what happened or is happening, then show it. Let it be a visual testimony attributed to your life. The refuge, which is what we call our big desert box, was the space to enter this part of your mind. Here you could bring up experiences, emotions, thoughts, feelings, or things you just don't like to think or talk about. So here's Ozzy with Marsha's mouth in the corner of the frame. I had them sit facing each other inside the studio space on an early cold morning. In silence, I wrapped metal wire around Ozzy's shaved head, as well as Marsha's face, while the two stared into each other. Prior to this idea, Ozzy and Marsha had been butting heads, so this exercise of embodiment was a response to that. They were locked together via these helmets for a few hours. They were talking to each other with their eyes, with the creases forming on their skins. I shaved my head the night before most of my self-portraits in this series. I find there is nothing to hide behind. No clothes, no hair, no shoes. You're open. Now when I look at the photographs of myself, it wouldn't necessarily be me, but perhaps a side of me that not many get to see, including myself. So I shaved Ozzy's head prior to this shoot, looking for a similar outcome. This is what a cancer radiation mask looks like, and this particular one belonged to a woman named Sharon, who died from skin cancer. I discovered her mask while I was working for her husband, Stephen. He explained to me what it was, this plastic mesh construction, and how one mask is an exact replica of someone's body. Therefore, you can never actually fit into someone else's mask. Upon the plastic mesh, targets and notes are placed so that the radiation can be aimed accurately at the cancer. While that is happening, you are lying flat on a steel table, with this shelling of yourself trapping yourself down to the table. After it had been explained to me, I began to visualize in my mind what the procedure might look like. It made me think of the mask as a relic, or a testament to someone's fight and desire to live. It made me think of my mother's dress, too. At first, I questioned whether or not it would be ethical of me to even use these masks. But having learned that most are disregarded in the hospital storage made me think otherwise. In my first project, I worked with my mother's dress also as a relic. Marcia told me she regretted getting rid of her cancer radiation mask that was used in her treatment. She never thought she would say that, but upon embarking on this project, her thoughts changed. As an experiment in my try for closure, I built Marcia this suit to mimic the body entrapment. It was made with dried bamboo that was harvested from her garden. I took her measurements and cut it to fit her like armor. Though she's afraid of heights, she's standing here on a giant boulder. The air is still while she controls her balance. As a result of these images and this project, Marcia and I actually were able to acquire masks as donations from people in hospitals in New Mexico. And it was interesting to see because a lot of these masks are different. Of course, they're different depending on the person, but also depending on the kind of cancer you had. So I think this one mask that was given to us just had a complete opening on the face. And I put seeds on top of it to give it this crown. A fight is draining. In the end, even if you beat your conflict, whatever that may be, you come to a liberation, but one with no wings. The suffering and fear, relief and ordeal, directness and brutality remains. What changes is how you respond to your trials. Two patients, Marcia and Tara, lay facing each other in silence and find mutual understanding through a slow assimilation of emotion, osmosis. What we do for each other, let us do it today, for we have no promise that tomorrow will come. So I'm gonna shift gears now a little bit and dip into another body of work that was being made while I was also working on trials in New Mexico. This is another great friend and collaborator, Aaron Garcia, who I must talk about when I talk about my work. Alongside the refuge space with Marcia, I was also exploring New Mexico with Aaron and making photographs with him. A lot of the feelings I would experience in day-to-day life with Aaron was something I would transmute into the refuge space. I met Aaron Garcia one day outside an Allsup's gas station and convenience store near my home in Santa Fe. I would hang out at this particular Allsup's for hours at a time, multiple days a week, and introduce myself to all the people that came by. I wanted to meet more people like Marcia, someone who I felt was on the same wavelength as me. There was an instant connection between Aaron and I, and before I knew it, we were talking about rocks and feathers, jewelry, ashes, and how intense New Mexico can be. Aaron also asked me what I was doing standing around at the Allsups, and told me he sensed a lack of home within myself. Aaron taught me many things about myself that were kept hidden and brought them to the surface, while also bringing a smile to my face. During our first encounter at Allsups, I asked Aaron if he wanted to embark on a project with me, and together we started making a visual record of his life along with his younger brother Russell Garcia and other men who lived with Aaron and wanted to participate in sharing a part of themselves without fear of shame or judgment. I would visit Aaron every day and learn more about him, which only drew me closer to him. I learned that Aaron's nickname was Pillar. He was given this name for his leadership and protection regarding many travelers, drifters, and people without houses. Aaron cooked for people, provided shelter, helped some find work, and brought relief to many through laughter and joy. I remember asking Aaron why he chose to live outside when he had a home in Kiwa Pueblo. And he told me stories of his experiences at a place called Camp Tule in California, where he got to live his native beliefs and traditions in a deeper way. When the retreat was over, Aaron remained dedicated to living in nature, choosing a spiritual victory against the social expectations surrounding living standards. This is the hand of a veteran who served in the Iraq War. His name is Eddie Zaidi, and I met him at Aaron's camp. He was staying with Aaron for a time while he was making his way to Fort Collins in Colorado. We spoke a lot about his time as a soldier. We spoke about guns, art, and we spoke a lot about horoscopes. He actually guessed my horoscope and told me he knew I was a Leo because his daughter is also a Leo. He was on his way to go see her and other members of his family, and he had plans to join a PTSD rehab center out there in Fort Collins. Aaron and I gave him a ride one day to the Greyhound bus station and sent him off. We still talk on the phone from time to time. There was always a lot of guys at Aaron's camp. I would always introduce myself to them and get into interesting conversations with them. And I would ask if I could make photographs. This is Aaron's cousin, Jeffrey. And this was actually made after he got into a fight with someone, and he just got stitches on his head here. A lot of the time, I wouldn't even take photographs. In New Mexico, you can't photograph in certain areas because it's native land, and you have to respect that. Certain things are just not photographable, and that's nice. You're there because you want to be there, not because you want to get something. When photographs were made, it was always me asking, can I photograph this? Or Aaron straight up telling me to photograph him. A lot of the images were made around that kind of exchange. It wasn't long before we were squeezing into my car to go on camping trips, and it wasn't long until Aaron and his brother Russell, who's pictured here, were coming over to Marsh's house. We were all learning about each other, listening to one another, providing a space for each other, and making art about it along the way. But things started to change in 2022. Russell passed away from a respiratory problem overnight. I've been reflecting on the past 3 years I spent with Aaron and Russell, their mother Mary, and other members of his family, as well as the community at the Allsups near my home. I can speak much more about that, but I'll just say this one thing. You're given an opportunity to reaffirm someone's life, as well as your own life, every time you ask, how are you doing today? And really mean it. 2020 and 2021 were probably the busiest years. It was me, Aaron, and Russell in my car most of the time, driving around New Mexico. It was an adventure. 2022 was much harder once Russell had passed. Aaron was by himself, and it felt like he just wanted to die. I tried to be there as much as possible with the camera, because it provided a distraction. It pulled him away from things, and it pulled me away from things too. A lot of the images I made weren't good, but the experience was good. A year later, in September of 2023, Aaron was murdered. This is probably the last photograph I made of him, actually. This Aaron and Russell. It was more about an exchange, as I said earlier, of him wanting to share something with me than me wanting to share something with him. An example is the day after Russell passed away, which is this day here. Aaron was staying at my house, and we woke up, and he told me he wanted me to photograph him outside. I really did not want to get up at the time. I was tired and sad and not in the mood to photograph, but he urged me to do it. So I set up the camera, put in the film, and he posed like this outside of my house. So this image is from that moment of him wanting me to photograph him. And I'm glad he did make me do that. This is Aaron's arm in 2020 with his indigenous name tattooed in the language of Queres. Aaron had bursitis when I met him, which is the lump on his elbow. This was one of the many long medical battles I would assist Aaron in when visiting the hospitals around New Mexico. Doctors would often drain it for him, but it was never actually healed. And this is his arm in 2021, a year later. Whenever we would go to the hospital, Aaron would always bring his rocks and his feathers and his tools with him. The title from this series on Aaron, No More Mud in Our Eyes, came to me because every time I went somewhere with Aaron, people looked at him with disgust. They would look at him oddly and register him as a homeless man, then at me wondering why I was with him, like we were some odd pair. No more mud was an expression to mean look beyond. It goes deeper than what you see. Aaron died in 2023. He was murdered one night and nothing got solved. The officers never followed up on anything. The case just disappeared. Even after his death, there was still mud in people's eyes. It's crazy because just last week I actually found a handwritten note by Aaron in one of my journals, and I'm going to read it. This is what it says. Quote, "We call upon our spirits, our ancestors, to give strength, wisdom, knowledge, and most of all, our well-being. Creator was once the greatest of all things and still is. Up to date, I was once a kid, was once a teenager, was once an adult. Rest now. What is saved is always learned and established. Make the right choice." And this is Aaron and I together in the refuge space after like a photographic session. Within the refuge space, when we are working with the idea of visual testimonies, we are also seeing ourselves as a living memorial. How past lives impacted cycles and patterns of survival, or perhaps vice versa, how cycles and patterns impacted past lives. Our bodies are these personal monuments that keep track of our time spent healing, accepting, transforming, or the adverse of that, our time spent on defense, agitated, upset, jealous. This is poison in, poison out. I've had to ask myself why I am attracted to illness and intensity. I believe my own sense of loss and unfairness has made me want to see other people who have experienced profound loss or that are going through a painful change in themselves. While each image in Trials represents a standalone saga in that individual's life, all the images together build a group portrait of empathy and victory. These are cycles of indignation and of healing, and our growth as human beings. So this is the last picture in my slideshow, and I always describe it as a self-portrait made by Marcia. I set up the camera and enter my installation. It's early morning light. It must be around 35 degrees, and the steel cables are dragging against my bare skin. Marcia is asking me vulnerable questions about my life, about the death of my mother, about my anxiety, about my addiction to smoking, among other addictions, about my fears, and we're conversing. I do my best to feel myself in that moment. I want to reveal something, and because of our synergy and trust, Marcia just knows when and what that is. She watches my mannerisms change and how my engagement in the installation changes in response to her questions. Stop, she calls out moments before hitting the shutter release cable. So that finally leads me to this book. Um, I published a book with Witty Books, and it's going to have all these projects in it. Contact and trials made over the course of 7 years, from 2016 to 2023. It's about 96 pages with 38 images inside it and 10 full spreads with an edition of 500. So it's kind of short, kind of small edition, but yeah, it'll be forthcoming very, very soon. And yeah, I'm excited to get it out, and hopefully y'all can get some pre-orders. And yeah, thank you. That's it. That's it for me. Thank you, rodents.
Wait, Andy, where do you see your photography going now?
Where do I see it going now?
Yeah, in the future, like what do you have like an idea of what you're gonna focus on or what your next project is gonna be?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to do less photographic work. I want to like do more installations and creating things. I love photography, but the more I've been thinking about it, I feel like photography for me was a vehicle to really like explore these other ideas, like the concepts of death and like time and passage and hi Sylvia and all these things. So I don't know, I really want to start letting my like installations just be installations. It's like I would love to like do photography as well, but I'm trying to think a little bit more beyond that now. Like I have these ideas of creating these giant balls, like giant 12-foot, almost like a giant beach ball, but it'll be casted out of what you use to like when you break an arm and you put casting around yourself
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, so
I'm gonna
plaster
make
Paris.
yeah, I'm gonna make like a casting, like a giant ball casting, and I
That's
want to
it.
create
That's a really different direction. I mean, from photography to sculpture, that's like
yeah,
a major change.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. I feel for me, it kind of feels like it's in line because I feel like a lot of my photography is kind of sculptural, so it's
That's true.
maybe paying more,
That's so true.
maybe paying more attention to like the hands-on things and the actual image. Um, but that's like my idea. Like I want to create these giant balls and I want to roll them down the streets of Los Angeles and like see what happens.
That's cool.
Yeah. And
So
the idea actually comes from Aaron. And now that we're talking about it, it makes me think of Aaron actually because he would always, the biggest lesson that he taught me, I would say, is he would always say to be round like a rock. Like, don't be good, don't worry about being good, and don't worry about being bad. Just be round, like, be everything. And so I want to, like, make these rocks, these round balls, and, like, continue thinking about that. Yeah.
Well,
so um, I would just like to say thank you. That was awesome, and thank you for sharing your work with this group and everyone who came. And I have a question for you, kind of two questions, but the first question is, so Rodent Society is just mainly comprised of young creative people, like undergraduate students who are just getting started and just dipping their toes in a bunch of things, and but nonetheless creative people that want to do creative things, hence why they're in this club. So just as someone who, you start off in journalism and then you quickly realize, like, I don't want to do journalism, I want to live this life, this artistic life, and do creative things and fully immerse myself in those things. What would be just like a piece of advice or just like a motto or just something you tell younger people who are just getting started and have doubt or unsure, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. I would just say to really try to pay attention to the signs in your own life. I feel like, it's hard to say because I didn't really know either what I wanted to do at the time. Like, I was studying journalism because I thought that was something that I enjoyed, but it's hard, Like, I feel like I got lucky in a way with my mom dying. Like, I hate to say that because it sounds so, like, backwards, but,
It shaped who you are.
huh?
It shaped who you are.
Yeah, it shaped who I was, and like, it makes me think of the Virginia Woolf quote too. She says, "My mother had to die in order for me to live." And for me, I just feel like if my mom wouldn't have died, I probably wouldn't be where I am now, or like what I'm doing now. Probably would have taken so much longer for me to realize what I actually want to do. So I don't know, when it comes to someone who's really like young, and just figuring out, I would say to just be patient but also be patient, but also like not like you have to like put yourself out there a lot and like go for anything that interests you and see if it really sticks. And yeah, it's hard. Like be ruthless, but be patient, and also just really listen to yourself and pay attention to what is happening in your life. Pay attention to the things that upset you in your life. Pay attention to the things that upset you, but the things that also make you feel good. And and just question like, why does this upset you? Why does this make me feel good? Or and just dig. Think about your life as like an investigation, and just push towards that, I would say. But it's really hard too because I do recognize my position, and I feel like it's very specific.
Oh,
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. And also, does anyone in here have any questions? Or yeah, Alex has a question.
Okay, so
Hey,
you mentioned this in the beginning, the difference between taking and making a photograph, and you realized that you would rather make them.
hmm.
What do you mean by that, and what is that difference to you between taking and making an image?
Yeah, for me, taking and making an image is about ownership. And when you make a photograph, it's more than you because it involves, like, as a photographer, I think you're almost not the important role when you make an image. I think it's more about the person that you are working with, or even the idea of literally creating an image, meaning like I'm gonna create this, like I'm gonna fabricate a world, I'm gonna create an environment literally from scratch. And when I think of taking an image, I think of journalism. I think of people who are going out to like war-torn countries and just kind of snapping these images and then selling them to newspapers, or even kind of street photography can kind of fall into taking, I think, because you're not really connecting or getting a story with people or getting like an actual um it's just not as rich to me. Like I'd rather have less images with like meaning behind them than just kind of snapshot images of someone just walking around outside and kind of snapping images of life. And I'm not trying to say that that's like not a good way to work. I just think those are two different ways. And for me, I personally gravitate towards the latter of making an image, especially because photography is already steeped in colonialism and so much of surveillance. And a lot of photography in the very beginning stages of photography was like all kind of street photography. So I think too about the medium, and I think like how can photography advance as a medium, and I think it comes with that idea of ownership, and also maybe thinking about images as something that's created rather than taken. Because again, as a photographer, like a successful photographer is their whole career is built on images that they take of people, right? And they kind of just keep them like in their pocket, basically, or in their hard drive, their archive. And it seems weird to like hoard all these images of people to then bolster your own career. But then it's like, what about these people? You know, what about all these hundreds of faces that you have in your hard drive and you may not even know their names? Like, I don't know. I think that's a little odd and weird to me. So I like the idea of reversing photography and making the ownership go like that way versus like up, you know? Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great response. Any other questions? Or anyone on the Zoom want to ask a question? If not, so I'll just take that as a no. This has already been a pretty long presentation. I would just like to say, yeah, thank you again. This has been awesome. And then you have this book that's being in the process of being published. So
Yeah. It'll be out very soon for like pre-orders and ordering and all that. Hopefully, like in the next coming weeks.
So
Yeah.
how can they get the book?
Yeah, this is what it looks like.
Also, where can they get the book if they want to buy it?
Yeah, you can get it on wittybooks.com. But I'll send out like a link and everything, a notification, so you can all see it.
All right, cool. Thank you, man.
Thanks.
Good time. All right.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks Keith, Alicia, Fabi, Anna, and Rodents at Rodent Society. Thank you so much.
And Sylvia.
And Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia, too.
Right.
Have a good one. Thank you, guys.
Okay, bye.
Bye, guys.
Take care.
All right.